I think this is a key question for us to talk about. Both of you are very familiar with the issues we're going to talk about in terms of threats. We know that conflict accounts for over 75% of humanitarian needs in the world today, and conflict prevention, peace building, and peacekeeping are widely accepted as critical parts of the international humanitarian efforts. In the past, we generally understood conflict within certain political or economic contexts, but new questions about the factors behind conflict and violence have been snowballing. The complexity of conflict and violence has changed, and climate change as a causal factor and its impact on humanitarian crises is more and more to the fore. And I remember very much clearly many years ago in the United Nations when we started talking about climate refugees, there was a very strong reaction from a number of countries saying, no, this is not an issue we want to talk about. And even more recently, when I was working with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and he published an op-ed in the New York Times about climate change as a driver of conflict between pastoralists and herders in Darfur, there was a very furious reaction from the Bush administration at that time saying, no, you can't talk about climate change in this context. This is a political conflict. There's no pure political conflict anymore. The complexity of this is increasing. The challenges are increasing. We're seeing deepening violence, humanitarian disasters from the Sahel to Syria. And the current Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, has talked about mass migrations from Africa and the Middle East that have rocked Europe as a toxic climate security nexus. So climate, instability, conflict, and humanitarian needs. So to dive into these two topics, we have Elhaj As Sy. You are already a distinguished Elhaj, I see. And he's the Secretary General of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent, one of the largest and most respected humanitarian organizations in the world, especially here in the Gulf, where the Red Crescent is a primary vehicle for humanitarian assistance. We also have Her Royal Highness Princess Sarah Zeid, who is one of the most prominent voices globally on maternal and child health, and her work along with the Red Cross and Crescent has helped to inspire the discussions we've had over the last panel and the last days. So let me start by asking both of you to reflect on your personal experiences that you've seen in the field, because you have visits to refugee camps, crisis situations. You see on a day-to-day basis how this affects you. Can you outline, and let me start with you, Mr. Secretary General. Can you give us a sense of how you see the evolution of humanitarian situations, the complexity of crisis, and the role of climate change in driving this?
Thank you very much. When we looked at just what happened in last year, 2017, we've counted about 400 severe weather-related, shocks and hazards, in the world that have affected over 23 million people, threatening their lives, threatening their livelihoods and their livestock, as we've seen, but also the ways of lives of people that have to adjust and adapt, and most of them having to leave home because home is no longer safe. It is no longer safe because the strategies of survival that people used to be developing and to cope, those coping mechanisms have been then stretched to the max, and then putting people on the move. And those people on the move, will make the headlines, when they hit Europe. But while I'm speaking now, it is the poorest countries, some of the poorest countries and most vulnerable countries that are hosting the largest numbers of refugees and people on the move in the world. About 1 million in Uganda, but we hardly talk about it. 1/3 of Lebanese population composed of refugees, and it is still not a crisis. 1 million in Jordan, and it is not a crisis. But 1 million in Europe is a crisis. You know, people leave home and then because home is no longer safe, because they want to be as close as possible to home with the hope, you know, to return. Because like one of them say, well, I can live on my own and then find a way of recovering what I've lost, you know, materially. I cannot live with the grave of my ancestors with me. I cannot live, you know, with also the environment and then the terrain that I'm attached to. And that's where, you know, the environment, you know, comes in, and then the climate change, you know, comes in. While we are speaking right now, Cape Town may be the first city, big city that is running out of water. While we are speaking right now, we've noticed over the last, you know, 40, 50 years that the Lake Chad has shrunk to 95% of its, you know, original size. 5% of the Lake Chad compared to what it used to be 50 years ago. But when we talk about the Lake Chad Basin today, we talk about the conflict around the Lake Chad, but we forget it was a lake. And when it is a conflict and what it is originating from, it is exactly because of that. If we add to that, then the rapid and unplanned urbanization, so we are getting more and more into the natural habitat of fauna and flora, sharing the habitat with the bats and then the green monkey. They can live with the viruses and bacteria and survive. We get the same viruses and bacteria and die. Ebola is related to climate change. Chikungunya, dengue, Lassa fever, Nile fever, Marburg. Unfortunately, even in this day and age, no plague, like we just recently experienced it in Madagascar. Well, conflicts, you know, used to be related to fighting over mineral resources and maybe oil and diamonds, but it may now be reduced to one simple commodity that we all are striving for and then we cannot live without, which is water, in the centrality of it. We see also a recurrence, you know, of climate-related shocks and hazards that are getting more and more frequent and more severe by the day. The Category 5 hurricanes that we are seeing now are quite unprecedented. I just returned last night from Antigua and Barbuda with the Prime Minister thing here to take stock of, you know, what has been done, and thank you for your leadership, sir, and then what is being done to help people not only respond to the crisis, and that is maybe the point I would like to finish the first sentence with, question with, but also to prepare. There will be a monsoon season every year. There will be a hurricane season every year. We cannot prevent that from happening, but the question is, will all those shocks and hazards, you know, become a disaster? The fact of them becoming a disaster or not will be pretty much depending on our capacity to prepare and to respond to it, you know, or not. While we are recovering, you know, from Irma and Maria, all those very catastrophic, you know, shocks with very beautiful names, now, you know, in 4 months' time, there will be another one. So the question is, you know, how can we, you know, make sure, you know, that natural shocks will happen, but they won't be disasters? How do we make sure that we prepare and then we invest now, you know, so that we have the outcome we want tomorrow? Because $5 today, or you pay $15, you know, 4 months down the line, I think the math is very clear.
Well, thank you very much. It's a very compelling picture that you paint, and I think a very correct one, because the nature of threats are evolving, but one thing we can be sure of is that they're not going away. The severity is going to increase, and we'll come back to potential solutions a little while, which I'm sure that you're seized with. But let me move on to Her Royal Highness. Your Highness, you're the UN Refugee Agency's advisor on gender, forced displacement, and protection. And you were recently in South Sudan, which is one of those areas that is severely affected by conflict, where we see drivers of climate, and where we see substantial underfunding of peacekeeping activities. And I just heard from a colleague in the UN that with the current cuts that we're seeing in peacekeeping operations, that operation is going to be hit even harder. Now, from your perspective, what does this nexus and these humanitarian conditions mean practically for security, development, and humanitarian actors in the field?
Thank you. An excellent question, and firstly, it's my great honor to be here. Unfortunately, though, attending such an outstanding summit means that my thinking is evolving as I'm going, and so my mess is what you're going to have to tolerate, and I apologize if I jump around a little bit. One thing that is undeniable is that climate change is a multiplier effect on the suffering of women and children and newborns. And that in the majority of humanitarian settings, that the majority of the population is made up of women and children. On average, 75% of a population in need is women and children. In South Sudan, it's actually 85% of women and children. And the impact that climate change has is that as the multiplier effect, is that it increases the suffering and also a woman and girl's vulnerability. And this is because it reinforces traditional social norms. So traditionally, women and girls have the responsibility for the family. They're responsible for gathering wood, collecting water, feeding the families. And climate change makes all of these daily tasks longer, harder, and makes women and girls much more vulnerable. Women and girls will take extra risk to go that further mile because they have to get the water, they have to get the wood. This exposes them to injury, to sexual violence, and to abuse. When so much time is taken in the everyday burden of providing, it means that girls have to drop out of school. They don't have time. It means that women are not free to contribute in the way that we need. They are the heart of our families, they are the heart of our community. And if they are unable to contribute to our economies, to our communities, we will lose that. And for women and girls, what this means at the end of the day is that they are trapped in a cycle of poverty and dependency, that this nexus between a humanitarian fragile setting and climate change does, is that it just reinforces the fact that they will never get off the sticky floor. Another area where humanitarian settings and climate change come together, and specifically in South Sudan, is where you have the population that has been forced off valuable agricultural lands combined with the drought that has affected South Sudan and the surrounding area. This leads to resource scarcity and price increases of foods. Women always eat last, they eat less, because they are providing for their families. And yet a woman's nutritional well-being is actually at the heart of what we need for future generations. If a newborn child, from conception to the first 1,000 days, 2 years, does not receive adequate nutrition from their mother, again, throughout pregnancy and until they're 2 years old, their cognitive abilities can be impaired. And this means that not only have we got our women and girls that are stuck on this sticky floor from which they are unable to rise, but we are impairing future generations. How can we talk about prevention? How can we talk about peace when we cannot get half of the population to the table because they are so busy? And that future generations are then cognitively disadvantaged because they haven't had the appropriate nutritional value because of this multiplier between humanitarian setting and climate change.
Thank you. And both of you painted a picture that I'm sure can give a lot of us sleepless nights in terms of both the nature of the threat we're facing, the manifestation of it in some of the refugee settlements I've seen in refugee camps in Kenya, very dire, similar situations. So we need to start looking for solutions. And I'm going to turn to both of you to talk about what those solutions are. And first of all, you, Mr. Secretary General, you know, you're managing a major institution. It has a very direct impact on refugees and conflict-afflicted people. Here in the UAE, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, the Prime Minister, has recognized the role of the Red Crescent and their leadership in a pilot project in West Africa, which dispatched aid before climate-induced crisis is predicted to occur. So that raises this whole issue of very interesting possibility of forecast-based financing. And I know in the UN it has been a big problem because you always have to mobilize after the crisis hits. You lose a lot of lives and a lot of time in that. So forecast-based financing and preparing yourself logistically, how does the Red Cross and Red Crescent prepare itself for this?
Thank you for raising the question as regard to solutions. Most of the time we are dealing with consequences of many factors we do not have control over. So there are many political problems that results into a humanitarian situation, but there will not be a humanitarian answer to a political problem. So first of all, I think what we need, in terms of solution is all of us together to call on political leaders to find political solutions to the political problems. So conflicts, start, we don't know when they end. They're getting more and more protracted. We're getting into the 6th, 7th year in Syria. We hardly remember when it started in Afghanistan and in Iraq. 30 years in Somalia, 30 years in DRC, and it goes on. As long as we have those fragile situations where political solutions are not found, the volume of humanitarian response which is needed, will be very critical. That's one. Second, in many places, where we work, and the most places where we work, that's where the hardest to reach people are and the most vulnerable are. In those places, the health needs are great, and there often no one single clinic, not one single doctor. In those places, often, like you rightly say, Princess, there are so many children, but there are no schools. Now, addressing those gaps and disparities and reaches those hardest to reach would be critical in terms of solution. And in those places, unfortunately, often there is no government. Now, it is about going where the citizens are. We call it today in the Nexus, walking the last mile. But honestly, if that's where the problems are greatest, it should be the first mile of the response to ensure that we do not have the problem we see. In those places, poverty is so acute that people have nothing, and those who have nothing to lose. And then the biggest danger that we may face in terms of, both security, peace, as well as climate-related, is to deal with a generation that has nothing to lose, or a generation that is lost because they spend their time out of school. And then some of the now technical, very concrete solution that we can take in terms of, responding to shocks and hazards so that they do not become disasters. One of them is forecast-based financing. Taking meteorological information, scientific, data, anticipating on where we will have the next shocks and crises, pre-position supply, build capacity of the communities, strengthen their livelihood, their livestock, including even their habitat where it is prone to flooding. And if we invest that, in advance, we will see that it will be bearing, a lot of dividend, down the road. But it is always very difficult to mobilize us, for something we have not yet seen yet. So we shouted that there will be a plague, epidemic in Madagascar. Please, let's do something now before it becomes a problem. And I'm asked, how many cases do you have? I said, no, I have now 70 cases, and they're doubling every week. And I'm told, no, it is not yet big of an epidemic yet. Well, should we wait until it is a big of an epidemic, to do something? Or, there is nothing smart about predicting a catastrophic situation and see it happening. The smart thing would be, there will be this catastrophic situation, and what we will do now, so that we have the outcome we want tomorrow. So forecast-based financing is one of those, and we are very pleased, to see that has been recognized, by also Mohammed, and we'll be very pleased to see that some countries, such as government, the German government, supporting that. We're experiencing it in a number of settings in the Sahel, in Mongolia, in Peru, as well as in Bangladesh, where we have, as you said, the combination of both, conflict, people on the move, as well as climate change. 600,000 people from Myanmar in Cox's Bazar, living in a country, the third of its territory is underwater, which is an illustration of what needs to be done, so that it is not only about the people in the move, but also the host communities. And investing in those, will contribute into the social cohesion. Last point, those who suffer most from climate change are those who do less against the environment. And that is also another dysfunctionality that we're saying. You rightly say we only have one planet, but we also have only one humanity. That humanity we share, and that we make sure that none of us will be safe until we all are, and then none of us, will be, protected against diseases and pandemic, until all of us are. And there is only one way and one place, to fight it. It is where it is happening and where the needs are greatest, and that is in those communities that are most affected. And our global solidarity, we hope, will be contributing to that together.
Thank you. Very, very powerful point. It is a question of global solidarity, but I want to ask you a one-sentence question as a follow-up to that point, which is that this requires political will. We're seeing new donors like the UAE coming in with the forecast-based financing, their commitment to that, others. Do you think that there is enough political will to confront the enormity of the challenges that we have right now? Mr. Secretary General?
On forecast-based finance, of course, is one that we will be proposing, to take it, to scale. We've seen that where it has been applied, it has been bringing some dividends. And sometimes, the skeptics will tell us, well, you do the forecast-based financing, but then the eye of the cyclone will not hit, directly. Good so. So those investments, that will be contributing into, building the resilience, of people for the next time around. And here again, maybe we should see that across a continuum. The continuum that is starting with early alert, early warning, that will be then followed by early action, in responding. And when we respond, we make sure that capacity and resilience is built so that the next time around, we come to that same places, we will not find the same communities in the same state of vulnerability. Every time we respond to a disaster or a shock, then we should leave that community at a stage, that where their capacity are strengthened, where their resilience is built, where they can also withstand the shocks, next time around. So the combination, forecast-based financing, investment in local communities, will also contributing into some of the commitments we made in the World Humanitarian Summit, through the localization agenda. Local actors are key. That's where it happens, and the way solutions will be found.
Thank you very much. Let me move to you, Your Highness. It was very evident in the way you were describing your experience in South Sudan, how touched you were by the severity of what you were seeing and its impact on children and women in particular, and the impact on maternal mortality and child health. You've visited these zones, you've seen the specific situations, you've seen the impact of climate change. If you had your way to push these large bureaucracies, what would you like to see change?
There has to be wholesale, systemic change in the way that we're going to approach humanitarian crisis. Just last week, the ICRC launched its appeal for 2018, and the budget requirements for 2018 are $1.8 billion. And this is an 80% increase since 2010 and their requirement in 2010. The average amount of time to be a refugee is 20 years. For ICRC, the organization that focuses exclusively on conflict, their 10 largest operations have been in these countries for the last 37 years. These are not emergencies. For a woman, this could be my entire life, from conception, being born, going through puberty, and having a child myself. So we have to reorient our understanding of what is a humanitarian crisis. That 60% of refugees and IDPs are now based in cities. They're not in easy to quantify and understandable refugee camps. So some of the things that we absolutely desperately have to have: multi-year predictable financing. How can you look at, how can you best serve the people that need us the most if you cannot guarantee how much money you're going to have per year? How do you plan? How do you build policy? How do you build resilience if you're only looking year by year by year? Better data, investment in research and development. We have to understand how better to get our resources to the community level. At the moment, I think it's only 0.2% of global humanitarian assistance actually makes its way directly to the community level. Person-centered, multi-sectoral planning across the entire continuum of care. I am nothing without the health and the safety of my children. I do not do anything in isolation. And so if you look at me and my health and my well-being and my ability to participate, if women are included in the peace process, the probability of that peace process lasting more than 15 years increases by 35%. And so if you want me to be there, you have to focus on my needs. And my need is that my newborn baby, my children are healthy, that they are safe, and that they are educated. Again, if we're only looking at bite-sized needs, food, shelter, year by year, we are never going to change our response. We are never going to invest properly. We will not be able to build up the resilience that is so desperately needed, particularly with climate change, moving storms into unusual places, making them stronger, hit harder, and the diseases as well. And so that would be, oh, and my last thing, of course, prioritize women and girls.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very powerful point. Very powerful point. And let me say, you know, in the face of the enormity of the challenge that we face as a global community, to have two such passionate, knowledgeable, motivated people working on these issues makes us feel much better about the situation. I think there will be a lot of people here who want to support your efforts in the future. But I want to end with 2 points I took away from this wonderful discussion we've had. One is, Secretary General, you mentioned that Cape Town, which is probably the richest, most advanced city in the most developed country in sub-Saharan Africa, faces an existential issue due to water. Can you imagine if there is no rain in the next months, what will happen to this metropolis? Beautiful city. It will be the end of the city.
Absolutely.
And we are seeing civilizational change as a result of climate, and we need to bear that into mind. But the other is what Forrest Whitaker mentioned, you know, the scale of what we're doing is not enough.
No.
You try every day, I know what you do with governments and how you try to mobilize resources and how you try to get public attention to these issues. What we need is a movement, you know. Forrest has started momentum in his setting. I think everybody going away from this discussion should think about this. This is something we are all in together. Our children and our grandchildren will be facing this issue. Where is the movement that we need to address the challenges of tomorrow? And that's what you have brought to us, and thank you very much. And I'll introduce our next moderator, a very brilliant young Emirati gentleman, Mr. Rahman Al-Awadi, who will take over the moderation of the rest of the session. Please join me in thanking our panel.